So thank everyone for joining us here in this inaugural call of the public portion of the COVID-19 Survey Method Working Group. This is a project that has been supported by a couple of different folks throughout the process. First of all, we have to give credit and thanks to the University of Colorado Boulder and the Converge program from the Natural Hazard Center that provided the impetus and the structure for getting these working groups together. This is a working group that is one of dozens of different groups that have been coordinated around COVID-19 research. They're working groups on different regional topics, on different thematic areas, looking at all different aspects of the COVID-19 crisis and how that affects disaster research and communities more broadly. And so these working groups provide a structure for investigating different aspects, from the overlap between COVID and other disasters down to methodological questions like the ethical dimensions of coronavirus research, or in this case, how to do survey and polling and questionnaire-based research more effectively. That's the theme that unifies this group together. Initially, we had just under a dozen members who came together to help set up a guideline document laying out some of the areas to investigate here. But that group has ballooned thanks to interest from others around the world. We've just surpassed 50 members in the official group mailing list who are involved in the invitations to these sessions and hopefully the broader conversations around COVID methods. And provide the backbone of participation. You can learn more about this via the link in the description at YouTube, as well as on the working group website, which is located at www.cempr.org. During these groups, we will have a series of guest speakers come in to help fill us in on the nitty-gritty details of how COVID social science survey-based research works. The idea is that these meetings are really going to get into not just the results that people have been finding with survey-based research, but they're going to really dive into the questions of how it's done and how it can be done better. This is a group for survey nerds, for polling geeks, for people who want to get into the really methodological and specific kinds of issues. And so we've curated a set of speakers from around the world who are going to explore different topics. This week, for instance, we have two representatives coming in from Statistics Canada to talk about the way that they have been using innovative different options with crowdsourcing and other public forms of engagement to poll the Canadian public about social impacts. And they're going to give us some details about how this happened and how it's being carried out. But next week, we're going to jump into the international context. We'll be talking with folks from the Winton Center at the University of Cambridge who are going to explore surveying across cultural contexts and looking at a multinational approach to surveying, how you can compare results on COVID research. And we're going to keep this up with different themes, looking at longitudinal mental health questionnaire-based research, diving into the role of private polling companies and consultants. We're going to look in at think tanks. We're going to look at political polling and how that overlaps with COVID. And so the idea is that these sessions will provide us with lots of fodder for discussion, thanks to these experts that will join us. To give you a bit of a sense of the format of how these weekly meetings will work, in general weeks, what I'll do in these first 10 minutes is invite people to participate via updates. So any members of the working group who want to promote their own research, who want to share results that they've released, who want to seek collaborators for upcoming funding calls or discuss opportunities that lay ahead, the initial bit of the meeting will be available for those of you who have joined in on the call to share and offer your comments on your own projects and ways that people can get involved. And we'll then take the majority of the meeting, the middle 40-45 minutes or so, to dive into these in-depth methodological explorations. And so in just a couple of minutes here, I'll ask Steve and Larry to share from the perspective of Statistics Canada about the tools that they've been using and their approaches to research. And then towards the end of the conversation, we'll try to take the last few minutes to explore a broader question in methodology related to COVID survey research. And again, hear from the people participating in on the Zoom call or from those commenting on the YouTube live stream in order to get some additional perspectives about these broader lessons. And so that threefold format will form the backbone of at least our initial stab over the first few guest speakers. The last logistical note that I'll offer is that these conversations take place weekly on Wednesdays from 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern, 1 to 2 p.m. Pacific time. You can watch them by joining the working group, which is how you get the Zoom invite here, or by watching on YouTube Live, where we'll be streaming. If you want to participate, I'll be monitoring the comments there and making sure to keep up with questions and get those asked as part of this meeting. And then you can always watch these asynchronously as well. If you want to be able to check this out later on, the recordings will be saved for posterity on YouTube via the Semper Lab website, so that you can come back and grab bits that might be useful. Now, with that, I would like to hand over the floor to our two esteemed experts from Statistics Canada. Larry Mcnab and Steve Trites have been involved from a fairly early stage with the COVID-19 research at Statistics Canada. When you think of a statistics agency, you might have stereotypes in mind about the pace at which they move or the kinds of projects that they do. But in this case, I think all of us across the country have been just really impressed with the responsiveness and the thoughtfulness with which StatsCan has proceeded, and the kinds of ways that they've tried to collect data that can be useful to researchers, both within government and more broadly. And so I'll invite them to introduce themselves initially, and then to share their presentation on the work that they've been doing. And I'll ask all of you as attendees to keep your questions along the way, because we'll have a chance in about 20-25 minutes to be able to ask some of those. So please do write down your questions, share them in the chat, or participate with the YouTube chat. And you'll have a chance to ask your questions then. So with that, let me hand over the floor to Steve and Larry for their presentation.
Thanks, thanks so much, Eric. It's really nice to be here with all of you. Maybe you can just nod, Eric, if you can see my screen okay here. Great. Okay, good. So we'll start out by just introducing ourselves, and then we'll walk you through some of the work that Eric was mentioning that we've been doing at StatsCan. So I'll start. My name is Steve Trites. I'm the director for the Center for Social Data Insights and Innovation at Statistics Canada. This is a new group that's been brought together under the guise of the modernization strategy at Statistics Canada. And a big part of what we do is about horizontal coordination. That's a very government way of saying that we try to bring people together. So one of the things that was realized while they were undertaking the modernization of StatsCan was that so often we work in our silos. So often we are experts at what we do, and we don't talk to each other enough. And so the group that I'm responsible for was brought in to enable this conversation, the ways of working together across our expertise. And so it's within this context that I've played a role, and my teams have played a role in terms of responding to the needs of Canadians in light of COVID-19. And of course, my colleague here is Larry, and I'll allow Larry to introduce himself.
Thanks, Steve. And thank you, Eric, for that awesome introduction. Larry Mcnab. I'm the director of the Center for Social Data Integration and Development. And for those of you that are familiar with Statistics Canada, we were formerly known as Special Surveys Division. But this name, I think, better reflects a lot of the activities being undertaken within the division, and it's aligned with our modernization context, which Steve mentioned. And we've been, I think, rather fortunately, given the current environment, we had been working on a lot of new approaches before COVID hit. And we've had the opportunity to kind of get a crash course in becoming experts on some of these new methods, which we'll talk about as we get into it. So maybe I'll stop there, and we can go on to our talk there, Steve.
Great, sounds good. So Larry and I will go back and forth a bit today. Basically, as you'll see, that our two groups work really closely together. One way to think about it is that the group that I'm responsible for did the front end and the back end of the work. So identifying the issues to be addressed, developing the content to go into these surveys. Larry and his group took care of the middle. They did all of the testing and the collections and the promotion and he'll tell you more about that. And then my group is also responsible for doing and coordinating and conducting a lot of the analysis involved here as well. So our two centers work really closely together. So on this slide here, you'll see that this is the overview of what we're going to talk about today. We have about 20 minutes. We're going to speak briefly about what many of you are so well aware of, which is the COVID-related data gaps that emerged as we were looking at social impacts in the early days and how they've evolved over time. Then we'll get into what Larry was talking about, which is how did we address this? Well, we developed two primary approaches here, one being a probability web panel and another being a crowdsourcing app. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the next steps as where we're going forward here. So, Larry, over to you.
Okay, I'm waiting for the slide to get up there, Steve. I don't have this memorized yet, given we pulled it together.
Oh, do you not see it? Sorry.
No, I got it now.
There you go.
So
Okay.
the world falls apart the middle of March. We're all sent home packing. And the question comes up, okay, how do we start getting information out? Not only quickly, which as was kind of alluded to, we're not generally known for, at least historically, for being the quickest of institutions, on top of everybody working from home. So, it was very quickly, we rallied the troops and started talking through ideas and the tools we had. I think the one fortunate thing with everything getting shut down is we had lots of people with lots of time on their hands, which allowed us to rally all our resources to making this happen. But it was really standing this up quick and taking note of the urgency of the situation and the role the National Statistics Agency could play in getting information in the hands of people that desperately needed it as this was evolving. So that was kind of, I guess, the context for how all this started. It's hard to believe it's been 6 months. It seems like a long time ago, but it was really crucial to be able to stand some things up quickly and get moving. And so Steve was he was right in the middle of working with experts and groups on information needs. And back on my end of the basketball court, so to speak, we were really talking about how do we collect this quickly and make it happen. So rather fortunately, and I'll talk more, we had some experience with some of the tools. I'll get into the details as we go, but we had been planning as part of our modernization initiative on experimenting with probabilistic web panels, perhaps a little bit different than what you're used to from polling firms, which are generally non-probabilistic panels. And we literally had just started that this year and had finished the recruitment, I think, a week before COVID hit. So a little bit of luck there. And we had some experience with crowdsourcing, not to the extent we're going to talk about before. We've learned an awful lot the last 6 months. But one of the good examples is when with cannabis legalization, we have been using crowdsourcing to try to get a handle on the cost of cannabis being provided by the illegal market. And so it was really then, how do we take what we have and allow this to feed into our COVID response? And so our web panel experiment very quickly became a key tool in getting information on quality information with using probabilistic methods on COVID. And as you'll see, crowdsource became our kind of quick and dirty, if I could put it that way, where timeliness became more of an issue.
So what we found was that in the early days of COVID, we pulled together folks from across all of StatCan, different subject areas. And one of the things that became apparent right away was that, and I suppose we knew this from the outset, but COVID really put an exclamation mark on it. So basically, we could talk to the economists who would talk to us about some of the data that they had that essentially were reflecting changes over time, in real time. in essence, right? And the health folks were able to get access to data that were documenting the changes, as it related to COVID. When you're looking at it from a social impact perspective, the first thing that became very apparent to us is that we don't have any kind of existing real-time or even close to real-time data sets. There's nothing we had at our fingertips. Everything we looked at, well, that survey was collected 3 years ago and won't be done for another 2 years. I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea, right? We have these great data points, but we didn't have anything current. So nothing that was sensitive enough to be able to monitor changes over time as related to COVID. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. I know we're more interested in the methodological aspects, and that's certainly Larry's expertise more than mine. But I will speak a little bit about, how did we go about determining what we should be asking at this time? So essentially what we did was we brought together a working group from across all of the social subject matter areas at StatCan. And the idea here was that we were aware that we were hearing from all these partners about all the different data needs they had, but we didn't know where to focus. Where do you start? So what we did essentially was to pull together this group, have one focused on the analytical aspects of it, one focused on the data development. So we split the group in two, and we essentially sent our colleagues out to speak to key representatives from government departments, non-government organizations, etc., and to come back to us telling us, okay, what are the top social data gaps that they're hearing about? And then you'll see at the bottom of the slide here, we quickly put together a prioritization criteria. So we wanted to know, we had to have some mechanism for making a recommendation to our senior management about why we should be asking about this and not that. So for instance, we set up a prioritization criteria whereby we were saying, okay, well, first and foremost, what's the source of the request? If Larry and I are sitting around reading something in the Globe and Mail and think it's a good idea to do a survey on it, well, that's great. But if the Prime Minister's office calls, our chief statistician and needs data, that's a little more important. So, we prioritize things like this, these high-level needs from departments. We looked at the urgency of a request, as in we asked ourselves with every data request that we came in terms of a gap, do we need these data today? Could it be, what happens if we wait a month? What happens if we wait 6 months, right? This is an important way for us to assess how urgent this truly is. The third point you see is about public good. We really, there's a at StatCan, we pride ourselves on public good of our data for good. And so, could the department that was looking for these data, would there be a way for them to turn this into a program or a mechanism for protecting Canadians, right? Was there a policy implication here? We then also looked at kind of the logistics of it. Is there a data source that exists? Is there administrative data that we could make use of, et cetera? And then of course, do we have the capacity? Do we have the expertise and capacity to take on these data collection? And then so within this framework, we were able to triage the requests that were coming our way. And so here are just some examples of the types of things we were identifying. And what's interesting is, of course, you will have all seen this in your work, but the demands, the gaps, the issues were changing rapidly over time, right? So in the very early days, what we were seeing was, some of our partners were looking, we didn't know were people responding to the public health messages that were out there. How were they responding to them? Where were they getting their information from? What were they concerned about? So we were able to collect data on these things in the early stages. Then very early on too, with the second bullet point, we were getting a lot of there was a lot of anecdotal, but then a lot of requests for information about the impact of mental health from COVID, from quarantines and so on. Food insecurity became a big issue early on, as unemployment spiked. And then, I think one of the third point here, perceptions of public safety. This was one that we're quite proud of, because this came onto the radar of our Center for Justice and Community Safety colleagues from their networks. And truthfully, it was before any of the civil unrest had really taken form across North America and the world. And so at first blush, we thought, I'm not sure if this is the best fit. But very quickly, through our triaging system, saw that in fact, well, this is important. And sure enough, we were able to go collect data that turned out to be extremely timely in light of everything. So, and then as we went, things, were evolving. Of course, families and children, these people, this has been a huge aspect of the work, or I'm sorry, of the impact of COVID. And then you see the point at the bottom, which is, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, while we're looking specifically at these topic areas, the large overarching data gap that we've heard about, over and over and over and over again, that has driven so much of our approach that Larry can speak to, is the need for disaggregated ethnocultural data. I mean, I don't have to tell any of you this, but this has been such an important aspect, such a critical gap. And so certainly it's been something that's driven our collections, and we didn't necessarily get it right the first time out. And so we've had to add in, additional layers of demographic questions to be able to get a more fulsome picture. And again, it depends on which of the mechanisms we were using. So that gives you some sense of, what we were hearing, how we were responding, and how we got to the type of content that we ended up collecting. So with that, I'll pass it back to Larry, who's going to speak about, the probability web panel in more detail.
Thanks, Steve. And you're being a little humble. If our data isn't relevant, it's not useful. So yeah, I would argue you had the harder job. So a little bit about the web panel. As I'd mentioned, this was supposed to be our experimental year. And the whole notion was we were going to recruit respondents from some of our probability surveys and ask them to complete a series of short online surveys. So for this experiment, we had, could you click one more time? It looks like there might be some graphics missing, Steve.
Oh, is that right? Oh, sorry, Larry. Oh my goodness, sorry about that.
Oh, that's
I think
okay.
I have a static version here.
I think it's the next slide. So no, it is. So it's okay. I can remember it. So,
okay.
So what we had done is, as part of our labor force survey, we have just scroll up. There we go. We had, we have after 6 months, we have respondents who rotate out from our labor force survey. So we contacted those 32,000 respondents, and we essentially asked them, would they be interested in participating in a web panel and providing us with their email address. The advantage of using the labor force survey is we have that wealth of information they've provided through participating in the labor force survey. With those households, we selected one person per household, and we had 7,200 agree to participate in the panel. And all they had to really do was provide us with an email address, and the whole panel experiment was conducted over email, and we'd send them a link to an electronic application and ask them to fill it out. And literally just by mid-March, we had just completed the recruitment, and we had this list of 7,200 emails, which we've been leveraging ever since to conduct these web panel surveys. And as you'll see, as we go on, we move well beyond the experimental phase. But the advantage to having emails for us is our general approach to conducting surveys is we start with introductions through Canada Post. We send a letter with a link, and then sometimes then there's follow-up via Caddy interviews. But our mailroom was shut down. We didn't have the capacity to print letters. We were trying to figure out as an agency how to leverage our collection infrastructure and our interviewers who were in the same boat. They were suddenly working from home. The effort we put into equipping all of our interviewers so they could work from home is probably the topic of a whole other conversation. But for the purposes of what we had, this was perfect because we had a quick way to contact respondents we knew quite a bit about. The only thing we didn't know was how many of those respondents were actually going to participate in the web panel, despite them telling us that, sure, go ahead, here's my email. So if you want to go down to the next slide, Steve.
You seen that, Larry?
Yep, it's coming
Okay.
up. A little bit of a lag.
Oh, is there? Okay.
That's okay. So I've already talked about, so we've gone through various topics. We're actually on our 5th iteration, but it's less COVID related. And throughout all of this, we generally had between 4,200 and 4,500 people respond to each of these web panels, and that's been pretty consistent over the last 5 months on a variety of topics. And it's been fairly consistent. I don't think I want to talk too much more about this slide, other than it's as far as an experiment go, it was fairly successful, knock on wood. But it's not perfect by any means as a method. But you can see you're able to get at very basic results. Some things we learned early on. A third of Canadians concerned with their health. You were able to get at least nationally, information on immigrants and seniors, families. So I think that the key point here is, if you look at the top bullet in the kind of groups, it's fairly robust as a tool, and we are able to dig down at least nationally, given the limited sample, to the various population groups.
One thing I'll just add quickly, Larry, as we go on to the next slide here, is that a bunch of these questions here that Larry's put onto this slide about some of these findings, we won't go into the analysis really, but just to mention that we have repeated a number of these questions. So from the first web panel into the first crowdsource, which Larry can touch on, but then also we repeated, so this was back in the beginning of April, that that these data that you're seeing in front of you here are coming from there. We also repeated this again in July. And what's quite stark, and we won't go into all the details, but just at a very high level, what's quite stark is the change in that few month period in terms of what are people preoccupied with, the behaviors they're using, what are they doing in terms of protecting themselves and protecting others. There's quite large declines in a lot of this when you look at that over time. And I would suspect that if we were to do it again in a month or so, we might see the opposite is true. We might see this ramping back up again.
Okay, so what are the advantages of the web panel? I think, as I've alluded to, it's rapid. We can we've been doing collection over a week, and within about 5 days from collection, if all goes well, we can actually release results. We are using a probability sample, so we can't extrapolate these to the whole population. And we only need to ask them things like demographic questions once, and we can reuse. We already know an awful lot about respondents, and we also know a lot about non-respondents, which helps with bias adjustment. Some of the challenges, response rates are lower, and when you're trying to look at the cumulative response rate from those that just recruitment, so we got a little under 1/3 from the rotate outs. Then we're getting about 65% response. That kind of is an overall response rate of 15%. And you need internet access to respond to the survey. So, there are some limitations. What did we learn in terms of the quality? So, if you want to go to the next slide, Steve. So there was some bias, but that slide didn't come out very well.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay, but we are able to account for most of that bias, and because we were allowed to compare to the labor force survey, we were able to see where that was. But even with weighting, there were still some challenges. Some things, for example, some groups which were overrepresented, married folks with kids, people with higher levels of education, where the underrepresentation lied, renters, divorced individuals and immigrants, which also tend to be less likely to have internet, and their generally a challenging group to get a response from anyways. But we as a tool and an experiment, it is a success, and we'll talk about next steps there. And it's served itself to be pretty robust over the last 6 months in responding to the needs. And so we're taking all this into consideration as we talk about scaling this thing up. So that was kind of our how do we come up with information that's representative of all Canadians? But then the question is, how do we do things quick? So crowdsourcing came on the table pretty quickly. And I think when this started, we didn't really plan the extent crowdsourcing would become one of our key tools. But the advantage with crowdsource is it doesn't even require emails. It's really through communications and kind of the snowball effect. Generally, if you include, we've been keeping these open for the most part for about 2 weeks. We're able to, from start to finish, get results out within about 3 weeks. We were very fortunate early on, as you'll see, I think in the next slide, we had an overwhelming response to the first one, which we were able to leverage, which I'll talk about more. And one of the reasons we were able to do that is throughout all of this, we asked individuals responding to crowdsource to provide their email address, which, yeah, man, your PowerPoint didn't like what I sent you, Steve.
Oh, sorry,
But
Larry.
that's okay. I can. So this is kind of a timeline of the various crowdsource initiatives we did. As I mentioned, the very first crowdsource is when everybody's locked at home, we're all isolating, wondering what we're going to do. We had an overwhelming response. We had over 250,000 Canadians respond to that survey, and we asked all of them if they were interested in participating in follow-up initiatives, and about half of them provided us emails, and we really leveraged that going forward to maintain our momentum. A couple of lessons here. I think topic is very key to this being successful. So the first one, I think, COVID was new, and there was a huge interest in kind of reporting their situation. Some other ones I'll point out. We also had, we did one on post-secondary students. This one came out just as the government was announcing the assistance package for students. We had over 100,000 university and other post-secondary students respond, which is truly mind-blowing given they're generally the hardest group in the world to get to respond to anything. But they were really interested, and we were really able to leverage our networks with our colleagues in the Center for Education Statistics to get the word out. And the other one I'll point out, which was successful as a standalone, was the parenting during the pandemic one. This was as the school year was ending. Parents were and still are fairly stressed, as a parent of teenage boys myself. So those stood alone pretty well and didn't take a ton of nurturing to make happen. All of the others, uptake by themselves was, I don't think it was as robust as we would have liked, but we were also able to leverage through that list of emails we got early on and through subsequent crowdsource to send emails to past participants and get them to respond, and that really allowed us to bump up the number of respondents all the way through, and it was kind of a key part of our success. Some of the other ones, you'll note the disability crowdsource was very targeted to a specific group, and the discrimination crowdsource, which we've just wrapped up and the results are coming out next week. In an ideal situation, perhaps we would have maybe done that earlier in the summer when it was much more in the news, but again, we were able to leverage the emails to get a respectable response there. Next slide, Steve.
Yep.
So crowdsource. It's not my preferred method to do things. It is a I'll call it a quick and dirty approach. And the main reason is it's non-probabilistic. You cannot you cannot make generalizations to the Canadian population, and you shouldn't. And that's one of the bigger risks, is explaining that. There's also lots of potential for bias creeping in, and it's a little harder to manage. Some of the things we learned, groups that are really hard to get to participate, males. Generally, we had three females respond for every male. Younger and older groups were tougher to get involved. Quebec was generally a much lower participation rate, and those with lower education, which are again pretty similar to normal surveys, but it's something to account for. Some things we did do, we instead of weighting, we came up with benchmarking factors to try to adjust for some of the bias and smooth things out as best we could. Modeling and marketing tools to get the response out there and try to beef up in specific groups. And it was a very, an active exercise. We were kind of day to day looking at response as it went and trying to target specific areas. But one of the other things we were able to do is, compare this to the web panel and some of the other work that went on to just see how valid it was. And despite all the challenges with this I presented, it did prove to be fairly similar to what we were getting from other surveys. And that's, I think, ultimately attributable to, just getting a large enough response. If we only had 5,000 Canadians respond, I wouldn't be as comfortable in the results. But, we were generally getting between 30 and 45,000 for most of them. And, in the first one, as I mentioned, we had a 250,000 people respond. So we've done all this. Where are we going to go? So I think in terms of an experiment, our web panel has proven itself. And so really our next steps are how do we expand that and make it just a regular part of our business? And we're also even considering specifically targeted web panels for specific population groups or geographies. So disaggregated data. Are there specific ethnocultural groups we want to panel? Or maybe considering having a panel for parents as they go through this. Also in all of our major surveys, including the standard questions to get that, list of email addresses to allow us to refresh and expand. Can we use administrative data to better target specific groups and sampling? And we're also, and again, this is with the view of being quick and nimble, and this has been on our list for a while. Starting up a kind of omnibus isn't necessarily the best title, but a generalized survey infrastructure where once every quarter we've got a planned collection using our normal survey techniques on a variety of topics to allow groups to come in quickly and get information out quickly. Maybe not within 14 days, but within a few months, start to finish. Prepare the questions, do the collection, and get the data out into the hands of the folks that need it.
So with that, I think we kind of come to the end here, Larry. What we've done here in terms of a link.
Oh, sure. Your name doesn't even come through. They're all going to pick on me.
I don't know what happened to this deck, Larry. I'm sorry. But anyway, what we have here is a link to, this is the COVID-19 hub. So for StatCan, this is where all of our releases are. This is where participants are invited to participate in the crowdsources. All of our relevant information is here. So I encourage you to check that out. What I might ask, Eric, is I forwarded over a copy of this that maybe turned out a little better than this one. But in at the bottom here, we're not going to go through them, but what we've done is added in the links to all the public use microdata files. So for folks who are interested in the content, in getting access to the data sets to conduct analysis, or for to learn from them, whatever the case is, we have links here for all of those data sets. So if you want to, I don't know if you want to share this, maybe Eric, after the meeting, but that information is all there for folks if it's of use to you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And one of the things we'll do with the working group is that we'll be collecting the slide decks from the presentation so we can get a corrected one posted up online on the same website as the schedule so that people can go back and follow the links and check out the information, because you've shared a treasure trove of data sets for researchers to dive through, whether we're looking at Canadian data specifically or for the international partners on the call who just want to see the kinds of ways that this is organized and available. I think this will be of interest to the group. So we'll get that posted up in the days that follow to the working group website under the history of past talks, and make sure that those links are there. So in terms of timing here, what I would like to do is that I'll ask a couple of questions here first, and then invite Larry and Steve to reply. And then I'm hoping after a couple of questions from me that perhaps we can get some questions from the audience and folks attending. So feel free to put those into the chat or to use the raise hand function if you're interested in asking out loud. But I'm curious to back up to Steve for a second here. When you were talking about the different partners involved, were there points where you found that there were tensions or disparities between the kinds of things that people were asking for, and how did you resolve that? And then how did you deal with it if their requests changed over time and as you saw that variation?
So one of the early decision points we had was about, I was talking about, everything, all these different priorities coming in all at once at the beginning, and how do you manage that? And so, yeah, I would say, from a learning perspective, what we tried to do the very first, might have been the crowdsource, was we thought, okay, well, we're hearing about mental health, we're hearing about, a number of different issues. Let's do a question on this, a question on that, and a question on that. Right? Let's try to meet everybody's needs all at once with one or two questions each. And what we realized very quickly was that doesn't work, right? When you go back to the subject experts who have raised this issue, they say, well, hang on, you can't look at food insecurity through one question. In fact, here are the 4 standard questions that need to be asked. They were asked previously in this setting, so we have a benchmark. And this is a scale that should be kept together, so we can't do it that way. So right away, we found ourselves saying, okay, well, there's your tension, right? We can't meet everybody's needs all at once, but which led to the decision-making process of saying, okay, well, if we're going to do something on food insecurity, we'd better do it right. So then then that prioritization exercise becomes even more important to say, okay, well, this one has to go first, and in the case of this one, it was, the decision from a number of different perspectives was that one, food insecurity as the example, wasn't going to work in a crowdsource because of the inherent biases. So we thought, no, it has to be a web panel. So therefore, here it lines up here, right? And then something else that was more appropriate to a crowdsource because we wanted a larger sample. Okay, that lines up here. So that's an example of the types of tensions and how we did our best to resolve them.
Yeah, thank you. Another question on that note, Anna has just asked in the chat about you had emphasized the importance of serving the public good. Can you tell us about how you define the public good? And if I can add in a layer to that, you mentioned at one point the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, or the like. How do you deal with the tension between the sort of political and public service priorities that you're hearing about?
For sure, and that of course is a joke about the PMO, but we would, because we're an apolitical organization, we would work directly with PCO as an example, as kind of the highest bureaucratic body that we would deal with, right? Sorry, Anna's question was about. So Anna, Eric, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Anna asked. You said that you want to want the data to serve the public good. How do you define what the public good is?
Right. So what we meant by that was, is there a public policy need? Would a key department with this information be able to make a better public policy decision that would serve the public good right now? For instance, in the early days, we were communicating a lot with the Public Health Agency. And I referred to this a bit earlier, but they were really interested in understanding where people getting their information from. They were concerned about disinformation. They were wondering if there were different trends as it related to people getting information from social media versus from, you know, the CBC or whichever news organization. And so they wanted to not only know where they were getting their information from, but then, you know, what decisions were they making based on that. And so there's an example, Anna, of where, you know, we were asking when we would hear from our partners about, well, we really want information about X, and we would kind of push back and say, okay, great, but what are you going to do with that information, right? How is this going to serve? And then we would use that to help inform, okay, well, it's really important because they need to get this out on whatever this decision has to be made, so therefore we need the data now. It's that kind of process that we undertook.
That's great. Thank you. Larry, if I can sort of come to your part of the talk for a bit, can you tell us a bit more about how you did the recruitment on that probabilistic web panel in the first place, how the outreach was done, and how you made sure to deal with some of the sampling challenges in terms of building a really representative constituency there?
So the whole key to that is really leveraging the labor force survey, which is, you know, one of our, you know, it's a gold standard for collecting information. And as part of the, you know, after people have completed 6 months of the labor force survey, we essentially inserted, well, actually, we followed up with them, with these individuals, with a specific request to, you know, would you like to participate in a web panel? You know, about a little under a third agreed to participate, but really the advantage later on is, because of the robust sampling and weighting methods from the labor force survey, and the fact that we know all this information about participants, we're able to leverage that information later on in the panel in adjusting the probabilities and weights, looking for bias. And you know, that's kind of one of the, I think, the key differences from a standard panel survey per se online, in the sense that you get what you can, and you look at the basic demographics and you weight things up to the census. You know, we were able to get much more detailed in our weighting strategies and look at education levels and all of the other tools available, all the other variables available in the labor force survey to do those adjustments. So I think we've still got work to do on the recruitment side, but because we're starting with a robust probability survey, we're allowed to carry that methodology through to the web panel and you know, kind of correct for some of the biases which would creep in. It's not perfect by any means, and we've still got a lot to learn. This was supposed to be an experiment, but that's kind of the notion. So now we're trying to figure out how to take that to the next level, and, you know, even figuring out how to combine samples and participants coming from a variety of probability surveys to generate our panels.
Oh, I did the mute thing again. Great answer there. And I want to say thank you to everyone in the chat. There are some really great questions coming. And so I think I will throw this to both Steve and Larry. Ricarda from Germany is asking about the approach to surveying deniers on COVID-19. So Ricarda says that they're coming from a science attitude survey in Germany, where they're interested in gathering data on COVID-19 deniers, but it's very challenging to do so via surveys that are conducted by public authorities. Is that something that you've encountered in the Canadian context, and how do you deal with this? And I guess more broadly, you've got the advantage and at the same time the Achilles heel of being the government of Canada as you survey. How has that affected your approach?
Good question.
That's a good question.
I don't necessarily think we maybe I'll let you start, Steve.
Well, what I was going to say is, yeah, no, we haven't quite come across that specific situation. But I will tell you that, you know, we did one of our crowdsources on the topic of trust in officials. And, you know, there's a certain overlap in terms of the government asking, you know, Canadians whether they trust officials or not, and the problem that you're facing in the scenario you presented there. You know, we knew there was a good likelihood that we're only people who trusted in the government would be responding to these types of questions, right? That being said, we don't want to be overly cynical. I can't get into too many details about a survey that we're about to release next week, based on the crowdsourcing we did on discrimination. But in there we have a number of we ask questions about this trust angle again, and I think what I can say is that it definitely presents itself as a correlate of a number of interesting outcomes. And I'm speaking like that because this isn't released data yet, and I can't say more than that. But my point is that under the guise of a survey, or I'm sorry, a crowdsourced questionnaire on discrimination, my sense is we may have, I'm hopeful that we may have attracted respondents who, in order to get that information out to the government, will respond in spite of perhaps having less trust in these institutions. And so I'll leave it there, but just to say, it is a difficult situation, and we've been facing that and trying to find ways around it. I'm not sure that we have a whole lot of advice for you, unfortunately, on that one.
Yeah, I think, one of, I think the advantage we have is we have a reputation of being neutral, and kind of unbiased in our approach. And, I'm not aware of any particular group that kind of criticized us for trying. At least the email stopped at the director of our collection area. But to kind of maybe build on Steve's, what we do make sure we do is we allow for the kind of spectrum of response. So for example, wearing a mask, do you think it's important, or changing your habits? And we don't judge. We just ask the question and let it come back. Thinking a bit further, if we were interested in getting at more of the individuals with maybe less have less faith in the scientific community, we would have the advantage of perhaps targeting them more specifically with some of the information, the responses we have, and following up with those emails. But to Steve's point, we haven't specifically targeted COVID deniers, if I could put it that way. But we could potentially tackle it just off the top of my head by looking at those who've responded and maybe are less trusting of certain levels of government or certain pieces of advice where we did collect that information. Not sure that perfectly answers the question, but it's off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I think that this is a really challenging question in general, and one that we probably will need to have a whole session on, is how to effectively survey folks who are skeptical or deniers or whatever the label may be. I will say very briefly, in our national survey, one of the things that we did was an experimental design where we recruited some folks to a COVID-specific survey and some folks to a more general health survey to try to see whether there were recruitment effects in terms of some of this. And we're crunching the data from that right now, but the early indication is that there really is not a lot of difference between who we were getting, at least early in the crisis, between these two recruitment methods. What we then did to try to compensate for this, we have a qualitative interview portion of our project attached. And so we're now using purposive sampling within our respondents to try to track down skeptics and deniers and the like, and go back with qualitative interviews to get these richer accounts from them, in a way that if we at least got them through the first round, we can make sure that they're accurately represented in some of the in-depth interviews.
And I do think you have to be careful too, and building leading questions and trying to maybe encouraging the response you get. So we focus more on attitudes and behaviors, and you could probably infer that someone maybe hasn't bought into this from it, but we didn't judge, and we didn't lead people down a path. So I think you need to be careful with that as well, because if you go looking for it, you're going to find it. It might not necessarily be the truth.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so we're coming up towards the end of our time, but there are 3 more great questions that I would like to get to from the chat. And I'll make one more ask of our audience as we're talking here. which is that as we answer these last three questions in rapid order, if folks on the YouTube stream or on the Zoom call, if you have themes of things you would like to see discussed, questions you have, challenges that you're facing, things you'd like us to talk about in future versions of these calls, please feel free to throw that into the chat now too, so that I can draw out some of those themes and we can identify the right people to have come in as guest speakers and join us here. But we'll end with these last three questions from the audience. And so Larry and Steve, I'll challenge for lightning speed replies to each of these. The first comes in from Daniela, who's asking about what Steve was mentioning on food security. They ask, were there any questions that in hindsight were too sensitive and might have prevented participants from contributing or finishing the survey? What things might you have done differently in terms of the survey design? I know we didn't get a lot into the specific items that were being asked, but how did you deal with these issues around sensitivity on things like food security?
Well, I touched on it in that example, and I'm just trying to pull the survey up while I'm answering here, but I know you want it quick. So I touched on it in the example. As frequently as possible, we relied on validated instruments that are used in, national and international surveys. And this is a perfect example. And like I touched on it earlier, but, and I don't have the name of it in front of me, I apologize. But the scale we used here for food security, and we did the same thing for mental health, if I remember correctly. These were 3 and 4 question scales that, our experts in the field said, this is what everyone in, the Western world is using to measure these things. This is a critical thing for us to measure, and we can use this to compare to baselines. So that was the approach we took. Again, I'm not sure if Larry mentioned this, I apologize, but, these were very short surveys, right? We're talking about, in some cases, 10 questions, in some cases, 20. We're trying to kind of be quick and I hate to say dirty, but we're trying to be quick and dirty and to get some information and make sure we keep people's attention. We, as to say it again, we as frequently as possible use validated instruments that we knew were reliable, that would take some of that risk out of the equation for us.
And maybe just to add to that, we tracked drop off as we went, and there was very little drop off from our survey. So we didn't we didn't see any indications that we were too sensitive with what we were asking.
Were all of these surveys consistent to everyone, or did you use at times split designs across surveys?
This was as basic as it could get. That's on our list of things to explore next year as part of our omnibus initiative, is doing some experimentation with split designs and trying to squeeze as much as we can out of a certain group of respondents, but we're not there yet. More to come.
Good teaser. Okay, 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up for the day. One from Trish is asking about reaching Indigenous populations. Were there any thoughts in terms of recruitment methods there, where in-person is challenging, web methods might require or run into some burdens of access? And if I can broaden this out, I would say just to communities where you were worried about response risk in general.
So surveying Indigenous populations is a challenge to begin with. And we have a whole center, the Center for Indigenous Statistics and Partnerships, and that's their job to build partnerships with Indigenous communities. As part of the crowdsource information, anybody could respond, and we did have we had a fairly healthy response. Like in the thousands, which is pretty good. But in terms of direct outreach, we have to be very careful, and we do have to do this hand in hand with the Indigenous groups. We did get the word out that these were going, and we asked them to promote, but we didn't. I wouldn't say we actively went after Indigenous peoples by ourselves. We do have to work with the other governing bodies, and even for our census, we're seeking partnerships to actually have Indigenous people to conduct the census on reserves as opposed to our own interviewers. So it is a challenge, and it's really the best practice is to form that partnership and do it together, not just us versus them. It's a group effort, and you have to invest the time in building the relationship to make that happen.
If I can just add quickly to that as well, another somewhat related example is we have a Northern Data strategy at StatsCan too, and so this is anyway, I won't get into that right at the moment, but basically, in order to increase the response in the north, we reached out to our partners in the territorial focal points. So the people who are responsible for statistics in the territories, to work with their partners. And what was interesting there is that what they recommended and what they implemented was kind of public service announcements through the local radio stations. And we saw for the territories that did participate, we saw quite a spike in terms of response that wasn't there prior to that intervention. So, it just speaks to what Larry was saying, which was, we found the same thing with the education crowdsource. Larry was saying how the response was so great among post-secondary aged youth, and again, that was all through our partners. That was because people that had direct connections to the students were reaching out and encouraging them to respond, and that seems to be what worked, regardless of which group we might have been targeting.
Great. One last question, and then we'll wrap it up. And it's fitting to end on this note. It's a question about timelines. Carrie is asking, how do you develop and determine the survey timelines and when you start and stop each one and when you ask things, given that there are so many factors continually changing? So 30-second answer to the timing impossible question.
For the crowdsource, it was literally day to day looking at response. We kind of developed a map to look at the proportion of respondents in each province and age group, and and the general rule of thumb we had is if you had to weight it, did we have enough that we'd have a maximum weight of 1,000 in each group? It's as much art as science, so we kind of developed that on the fly. And in certain cases response wasn't there, and we decided to extend it and until we got something we were comfortable with. So it was really looking at coverage by age and gender and province, and that was kind of our basic tool, which we looked at daily. It's where the art and science of statistics comes together.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for this. Steve, Larry, I am so grateful for your willingness to participate and be part of the conversation today. This has kicked off our public series of discussions really quite effectively. And so I'm sure everyone joins me in a rousing round of virtual applause for Steve and Larry and Statistics Canada and their insights here into survey-based approaches. Next week, as part of the series, we are going to be changing gears a little and looking far beyond the single national context. We will have Drs. Alexander Freeman and Sarah Dryhurst from the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication out of the University of Cambridge. They'll be talking about an absolutely massive project. If you thought the first round from StatsCan was big, they're tackling across several different countries, looking at comparative measures of COVID. And so we'll take this to the international conversation with Dr. Freeman and Dryhurst next week. So please join us, same time, same place. And if you're interested in joining the group and you're watching us on YouTube or viewing this after the fact, just visit semper.org, CEMPPR.org, and you'll be able to sign up as a member of the working group. We're really looking forward to the conversation next week. And thanks so much, Larry and Steve, for a really informative talk this week. Until next time, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks so much, Eric. Really appreciate it.
All right, we are off of